This is Nasha Kasha, Ukrainian Almanac, 28 minutes of stories about Ukrainian life. Nasha Kasha comes to you from Radio Western in London, Ontario, Canada. It's heard on 13 university and community radio stations in 8 provinces from Newfoundland to British Columbia. Вітаю вас, дорогі слухачі. Welcome. This is episode 149. In 1908, writer Lucy Maud Montgomery introduced the world to orphan Anne Shirley. Anne's new parents had expected to adopt a boy to help them cope with chores on their Prince Edward Island farm. To their bewilderment, they were sent a bright, red-haired, very spirited girl. Anne would win them over. She would grow up to be loved and admired by everyone around in PEI and to become a role model for young girls and women around the world. Today, millions of her soulmates make the trip to Prince Edward Island. There, they discover the land that so captivated Anne. Here's the thing. Anne Shirley is but a fiction, a character in a Canadian novel. Still, her character's qualities, the compassion, integrity, industry, intelligence, and drive are genuine. These have stayed true for fans for well over a century. Ukraine, too, has a role model who has captured the imagination of the population. The fictional TV character is a school teacher who, by accident, becomes president. He takes up the challenge, fights corruption, seeks harmony, works for the benefit of ordinary people. The actor playing this fictitious president is now running to become Ukraine's real president. Today we'll try to separate fact from fiction, learn about Ukraine's elections, about life there. In London, Ontario, first, for context, we'll hear from a university professor who specializes in Ukraine. Then, from a friend of mine who grew up near London, Ontario, but moved to Ukraine for years, working on its transition from communism to a market economy. Both interviews were recorded before March 31st, 2019. Voting day in Ukraine had not taken place yet.
My name is Marta Dechuk. I teach history and political science at the University of Western Ontario. I'm also a fellow at the Monk School of Global Affairs at the University of Toronto and adjunct professor at the National University of the Cave-Mahill Academy. Well, very briefly, I was born and raised in Toronto. I didn't know that I wanted to be an academic. I went to university and was just pursuing my interests, which were international relations, Ukraine, art, and ended up doing a master's degree at the London School of Economics, and then went to do a PhD at Oxford. Traveled to the Soviet Union to do research for my doctorate, ended up watching the Soviet Union collapse, got into journalism, worked for The Guardian and Radio Canada International for a while. Finished my PhD, got a job teaching at the Cave-Mahill Academy, then came back to Canada and got a job teaching here at the University of Western Ontario.
Ukraine is one of your areas of expertise.
Absolutely. This has been my research focus since the beginning.
You spend a lot of time over there.
I travel there regularly. When the term finishes, I go to Ukraine to collect data for various studies. I have been closely involved with media journalists really since the early 90s when I lived there, and have been watching and writing about the development of Ukraine's media landscape. There are a number of new projects, one of which I became involved with, which is Hromadske Radio, which is Public Radio Ukraine. I plan to go there again this summer to collect some more data.
What did it feel like working and living there, you, a Canadian of Ukrainian roots?
Things are very different in the early 90s and in the 2000s and in the present. So Ukraine's constantly changing. It was unusual being a foreigner in the early 90s. There were very few non-Ukrainians living there. It's now pretty normal. There's quite a large community of all sorts of foreigners who live in Ukraine or travel to Ukraine regularly. So I'm an observer. I'm an analyst. I'm not from Ukraine, and I don't vote in Ukraine. I don't live in Ukraine.
As an observer and an analyst and an academic, how is this election, if it is, different from others?
It both is and isn't. There's been a lot of attention to this election, which is, I think, a positive thing. There's been a lot of tension within Ukraine. This morning, I read something by Hromadske Radio, Kirilo Lukarenko. He used to be the chief editor. He's now been promoted to a higher position. And he basically posted this video saying, just stay calm, go vote. The world will not end when the election is over. Because there seems to be quite a lot of tension about who to vote for and what these elections mean. But if you look at Ukraine and politics with a long view, this happens every time there's an election. This is the most important election, and Ukraine's future will be decided on this election. And every time there's an election, there's this rhetoric. And to some degree, it's true. But I think that there's no need to overemphasize. I don't believe Ukraine will disappear off the map.
39 candidates running for president, 3 top runners. Can you just give me an overview or a sense of why that happened and where that's going?
Yes, 39 candidates. There were more. Huge list of candidates. Don't have a good answer for it, except that some are using it as a platform for the parliamentary elections that are coming in the fall.
Which means that here I'm getting my name known, and when I become a candidate for the parliamentary elections, which are separate, I'll have a better chance in terms of being identified by the public?
Absolutely, and also the political parties, because the parliamentary elections will be party elections. So someone like Andriy Sadovey, who is the mayor of Lviv and also the head of the Samopomich party, this is a way to get publicity for his party in a different context, or various other political parties that are preparing for the election in the fall. This gives them a platform to reach larger audiences. So that's one strategy. That said, there are 3 leading candidates, top 10 candidates from that big long list. The 3 leading candidates are the incumbent President Poroshenko, former Prime Minister Yulia Tymoshenko, and a wildcard candidate, Volodymyr Zelensky, who's an actor who plays an ordinary man, a history teacher who becomes elected president on a popular TV series. The theme is that this is an ordinary guy who becomes president. So he has become the front runner, and he's the one that's getting most of the attention. Both the incumbent President Poroshenko and former Prime Minister Tymoshenko have been polling high, but they've also got high negative ratings. The wildcard Zelensky candidate, he seems to be the one that's being presented as new politics. That this is not a politician, someone fresh coming in that will do a new kind of politics in Ukraine. Something to remember, though, is that he is being allegedly backed by one of the big oligarchs in Ukraine, Ihor Kolomoisky. And Ihor Kolomoisky is also the owner of the TV channel 1+1, where this popular TV series airs. I think the big message from this election campaign is that this is a democratic process.
Was there a letdown following Maidan?
Well, again, as a historian, there's always sort of, after a revolution, there's that sort of letdown that happens. So that's absolutely normal. The factor of war has been a major contributing factor to everything happening in Ukraine's politics. Living in a country at war is extremely stressful. You have people being shot at and killed and coming home injured, post-traumatic stress disorder, and so on. So this is a huge factor. But the changes, the positive changes, have not been highlighted very much in Ukraine's media. There's been quite a lot of positive that's happened that is simply not being reported. There tends to be a focus, as media does, focusing on the negative.
The positive being?
The positive being that if you look at the big picture, Ukraine has been invaded by Russia, which has the second most powerful army in the world, and they basically fought them to a draw. Now, the war is not, Ukraine's not winning the war, but it's not losing it either. And that, in and of itself, I think, is a huge accomplishment. The fact that the Ukrainian military has transformed over these past 5 years into what is actually a pretty effective fighting machine. If you look at what the army looked like in 2014, it was a mess. It was completely corrupt from inside. It had been cannibalized, poor training, poor morale. There's been training missions coming from various NATO countries, from Canada, from others. And what these NATO trainers are saying is we are learning as much from Ukrainians as we are teaching. That's, I think, something that Ukrainians don't often see about what they've accomplished. The economy is actually in growth. It's overall a difficult period for Ukrainians. But if you look at the macroeconomic indicators, and again, if you compare it to 2014, where the economy was practically bankrupt, and when the new political elite took power, the coffers were practically empty. They managed to stabilize the economy, and the economy's gone into growth. Investment is growing. If you look at the statistics, which few people are following because they're looking at things like energy prices are going up. Well, yes, but that's part of regulating an economy and bringing it into normal patterns. This is something that happened in countries like Poland in the early 90s, and Ukraine never actually revised the structure of its, energy sector. It's been subsidized, it's been corrupt, but energy costs money. And it can't be cheap because there is a real cost associated to it. And the painfulness of raising prices is something that's causing a lot of distress for people. But the sooner they do it, the sooner they can move on.
You talk about the distress of war and the obvious hurt and the injuries and deaths that come with it. But there is a good section of Ukraine, the eastern part involved in the war, and Crimea that can't vote.
That's absolutely true. Crimea, after it was annexed by Russia, it's now formally part of the Russian Federation. So people living in that peninsula have had Russian citizenship imposed on them. Some of them have kept their Ukrainian citizenship and they travel out of Crimea. So those people, if they choose to, they can leave and vote on Ukrainian territory or territory that's controlled by the Ukrainian government. People who are living in the areas that are in the so-called Luhansk and Donetsk People's Republics, should they choose to leave and go to areas that are controlled by the Ukrainian government, if they register, they do have the right to vote. They have been disenfranchised in some ways, but if they do want to vote, they could still exercise those rights.
International observers, both from a Canadian organization called Canadem and from the Ukrainian World Congress, are in motion as we speak. Is there still a moral suasion to having observers on the ground in terms of how the election is comported?
Well, I don't know that it's a question of moral suasion. I think that international observers are the eyes and ears to see whether an election is conducted fairly. And that is a normal part of elections in so-called emerging democracies. We don't have them in Canada because our democratic process is considered to be stable and established, although people who do want to come and monitor our elections are welcome to do so. But in countries like Ukraine, where there are still questions about democratic consolidation, international observers, they come and they watch and they say whether all the procedures have been followed or not. So you mentioned Crimea. When there was an event that was called a referendum, there were no observers allowed. So we don't actually know what the voting was like. We don't know how many people voted. We don't know how many people were coerced. We don't know how the vote counting happened. We don't know if there was ballot stuffing. We don't know. Whereas if you have international observers, they watch and they report.
The diaspora, the Ukrainian World Congress, has used the term crisis in logos and in presentation. Can you just position the word crisis and whether it fits at this point in this election?
Well, I don't know that the election is a crisis. Ukraine is a country at war and going through difficult economic transformation. So that could be defined as a crisis in many ways. That has not stopped Ukraine from organizing. This is now going to be the third election in that context. Well, yes, crisis, but it's sort of a prolonged crisis that doesn't prevent the normal governance of the country. Ukraine has been functioning imperfectly, but it has, a functioning economy. It has a political system that functions. Its society's functioning. Again, there are lots of problems, but, you could say is the United States in crisis because of everything that's happening in Washington and outside of Washington.
Could you share some of your thoughts, maybe a little bit of thinking and voicing on the patterns that you see in this election?
The important thing to keep in mind is the Ukraine's electoral system is that they don't have a first-past-the-post system. So for a candidate to win, he or she has to receive 50% of the vote. If that does not happen, then they go to a second round, and the top two candidates run off against each other. That's been the pattern in all of Ukraine's elections except one, which was the 2014 presidential election. Petro Poroshenko has been targeting the pensioners. That's a stable electorate, but if the weather's terrible, they may not go out to vote. Zelensky has been targeting the youth male vote, so the 25 to 50 male vote. There's around 2 million internally displaced people, whether they will vote.
Who does Yulia Tymoshenko appeal to?
Her support is in central Ukraine from people who don't like President Poroshenko. She's a populist. She's also targeting women voters.
Is it facile? Is it too facile to compare Zelensky, Kolomoisky's candidate, or Kolomoisky supported candidate, to Donald Trump? I mean, is Ukraine in the mood for populism, and is he the answer?
Populism is a global trend. Ukraine, I think, is very much in keeping with this trend of this populist leader, although Yulia Tymoshenko is also a populist, so there's different kinds of populists. I think Ukrainians are sending a very clear message that they want change. The candidate that seems to be promising change is Zelensky because he's a newcomer, he's an outsider. Whether he'll deliver, what he'll deliver, that's an open question. And Ukrainian elections, if they've taught me anything, is be prepared for the unexpected.
Я люблю свою страну, люблю свою жену, люблю свою собаку. Я всего на свете член, почти что супермен, но редко лезу в драку. Знает весь двор мой приговор, слуга народа.
This is Nasha Kasha, a Ukrainian Almanac. We're heard on CHRW-FM in London, CKLU-FM in Sudbury, CILU-FM in Thunder Bay, CKMS-FM in Kitchener, CFMU-FM in Hamilton, CFRC-FM in Kingston, and on CJLO-AM in Montreal.
Слуга народа.
This is the theme song from that TV show, Servant of the People, Sluha Narodu. It's performed by Dmytro Shurov. Servant of the People is also a political party in Ukraine, registered on March 31st, 2018. Earlier in our program, you heard Newfoundland's The Kubasonics from their album Kuba Funland. The song is simply called Goat 1. Potato pancakes. In a Jewish deli, you'd call them latke. Ukrainians call them platske. Not sure which came first, the platske or the latke, but my friend Peter is pretty good at making them. These days, Petro, or Peter, provides care for his mother, and he lives in his boyhood home, which backs onto a peaceful expanse of Brescia College. I am here to learn more about Peter's time living in Ukraine, the economy, the experience, the environment, and most of all, the elections.
My name's Peter Sochan. I live in London, Ontario. I was born in the area, grew up here, and I've lived in most parts of Canada, many parts of Canada, and in Ukraine for about 10 years. 2 sisters, younger, both teachers, and the family is heavily populated with teachers. Grew up on a farm 5-6 miles outside of London, then moved to London, the city, when I was about 13. I was garden farming, and it was basically hobby farming. Dad worked in a factory. The largest crop was potatoes, so I know every kind of potato.
The farm, the stand, the potato sales, is that how you got interested in economics?
Money is the lifeblood of politics, and economics on a national level influences politics. So if you want to take a look at what drives a lot of political decisions, it's my belief, and it has been from a young age. I like thinking globally. I like thinking in large macro ways, and economics is the way to view it.
Where were you trained in that kind of analysis?
Well, I had an undergraduate degree at University of Western Ontario here in London in economics and history. History is my other great love. And after that, graduate degree in MBA, Master's of Business Administration at Western's Ivy School. I always wanted to make a large amount of money, never did, but I did work with other large amounts of money for governments. So I guess I got my satisfaction in that fashion. And so I went as an advisor to Ukraine, and they ultimately put me into a newly formed bank entity that was an Export-Import Bank of Ukraine, which was exactly my area. At the 1990s, were in Ukraine mostly a period of stagnation of thought, development, and change. I recall in 1994, the first presidential election, when the first president of Ukraine, Kravchuk, lost to Kuchma, who was the second president of Ukraine. The evening of that election day, I was in my apartment about 7:30 at night, and the voting period usually went till about 8 o'clock in the evening. The doorbell rang, I came out, and there were three lovely middle-aged ladies standing in front of me, one holding a box. These ladies with a broad smile asked me if I had voted. I said, no. I said, well, we can make it easier for you. We've got a ballot box here. I said, no, I still don't think it'd be well, why not? Well, I said, well, because I'm not a citizen of Ukraine.
Would they have given you a ballot?
I'm pretty sure that they would have, because I had to talk them into not having me vote. I was in Ukraine for that first period about 9 years.
9 years, that would take you to the 2000s. You left and came back?
Our son was 12 years old. At that time, Anglo high schools in Ukraine were not that well developed, and we were concerned about his education. And secondly, I ended up, you were asking if I worked for the same people all the time. No, I worked for a lot of people, and at that time, just before I came back, I was working mostly for the Americans, USAID, the United States Agency for International Development. I had done consulting for the World Bank, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, EBRD.
You went away and then came back again.
I restarted going to Ukraine, if you like, in 2012, primarily on the election supervision monitoring missions.
How many times have you been an election observer?
4 times.
And what kinds of examples of what you're talking about have you yourself witnessed?
We would time and again get people who would show up at a hospital, psychiatric hospitals especially, where people are allowed to vote. They would show up 10 minutes after 8 in the morning when voting was to start, 10 minutes after the opening of voting, and they would find out that 1,000 to 1,100 people had already completed their voting. We would see bags that would arrive at the central polling place that had been ripped open. Well, there's what's called carousel voting. People would travel in buses, literally, from one polling station to another and vote several times. The candidates would often fight amongst themselves, and the contest would be fairly competitive. Well, in one case, in Cherkasy Oblast, one of the contenders, they have the right to send their own monitors out to the election count areas. It so happened that about 3/4 of an hour before they were to leave their headquarters office where they had gathered to go out to the polling stations, the police had surrounded the headquarters of that candidate and wouldn't let any of the monitors out of the candidate's office. And I read an article. The author argued that the last entities of society to change when you come out of a dictatorship or out of a corrupt previous political entity, the last entities to change are those of power: the police, the military, the judiciary, the procurators, or the prosecutors. They were the instruments of power in the past. They are the most packed with the people that are, in essence, the most corrupt in many ways.
But a large portion of society is the ordinary person. The day-to-day life goes on. How promising are these elections and the horizon in Ukraine's future to these people when they see the support for power, and the power would be the oligarchs, I would presume, and the leadership who are supported by the oligarchs? What can you speak to hope?
One of the things that we see today is we have a great deal more transparency. Transparency has shone a light on many of the crimes that exist today. We have the oligarchs. Well, the oligarchs are identified. They are visible. We have a media. These people tend to make a show of the sins of others. Many of the people that take the bribes, do the stealing, break the laws, whatever, they get unwanted attention. I use the example of Moses in the Bible and the 40 years of wandering in the desert. This change that needs to occur in Ukraine and other countries, in my view, is a multi-generational change. It cannot and will not happen in the first generation. They grew up with that. They will only change slightly as things come in. Their children as well, because they teach their children. It's not until the grandchildren come in that real change of attitude and mind has a chance.
Do we need a leader in Ukraine who will smash the tablets and get angry?
That could work. That example, for instance, worked in Singapore, where they had a Prime Minister, Lee Kuan Yew. Singapore was notoriously corrupt and poor. He, through brutal authority, managed to change much of that society, and it's become quite wealthy today. Now, in Ukraine, I'm one of the people who is mightily afraid of a dictatorial approach, of the strongman approach. I'm scared that a person will come in that, rather than cleaning up the place, will be a corrupt individual. Now, the people don't like corruption. People complain about it all the time. And yet, to be honest, they almost all participate in it. Well, to survive. And it's part of the culture. And not until we get a majority of people thinking otherwise, that are willing to risk their reputations and well-being to change it. But I think it takes generations.
To close the show, you're listening to Evan Wish. The melody he composed and plays now is called And What If? Leadership in the very heart of Europe is changing. Slovakia borders Ukraine to the southwest. Its voters chose a liberal newcomer. Environmentalist Zuzana Kaputova is that republic's first ever woman president. With the first round of the Ukraine election complete, a decisive face-off between incumbent President Petro Poroshenko and newcomer Volodymyr Zelensky is destined for April 21st. Zelensky has already captivated many voters. He projects the embodiment of the fictional TV president he portrayed in Servant of the People. Many voters in Ukraine believe that the idealistic character and the candidate Zelensky could become one and the same. The question is, does Zelensky believe it? And presuming he does, can he deliver and truly become a servant of the people? I'm your reporter, Stefan Andrusiak. Partial funding for Nasha Kasha comes from the Canadian Foundation of Taras Shevchenko and the Ukrainian Credit Union. Back in a week, God willing. До милої зустрічі за тиждень часу, дорогі слухачі.